Hello, my name's David Gleave, and I want to talk to you today about a book called Football's Black Pioneers that I've written with a colleague, Bill Hearn. It tells the story of the first black player at each of the 92 Football League clubs. Bill and I are football fans, and we've both got an interest in black history, and we've been working together on a project to do with black soldiers who served in the British Army in World War One, project that my wife was involved in as well. And that was coming to an end towards the autumn of 2016. And then out of the blue, Bill contacted me and said he'd had an idea. He thought, why don't we research the first black player at each Football League club and then write about them? And my immediate reaction was that I thought that sounded like an absolutely brilliant idea, but I also thought it sounded like ever such a lot of work because there are 92 clubs. But we agreed to go ahead, and 4 years later, the book, Football's Black Pioneers, is the result of 4 years' work. It was a lot of hard work, I was absolutely right about that, but I think it was well worthwhile because it's an interesting book, and for me it goes beyond just football, and I'm hoping to explain over the next few minutes why I think that's the case and why I think it should be of interest to people who aren't necessarily particularly interested in football. Because it's a football book, we laid it out in alphabetical order by club. So it starts at Accrington Stanley and it works its way through to Wycombe Wanderers. But we did discuss other ways of setting the material out. And I mean, the obvious other way would have been to do it in chronological order by date of debut. And I think if we had done that, we would have ended up with a book that had a very different feel to it. It would have been much more a book of social history and black British history in particular. We did it the way it is, and I'm happy with the way it's turned out, but I want to just give you a flavour of what that other book might have looked like if we'd written it, if we'd sequenced the stuff in a different order. Before I do that, I just want to say a little bit about myself and why I'm interested in black history in particular. I've been married for over 40 years and my wife is black, and we have 3 children, and we decided quite early on that we wanted them to understand both aspects of their heritage, black and white. And we knew from experience ourselves that they wouldn't get much black history in school. They'd be taught the English version. I mean, I went to a predominantly white school in the 60s. I mean, I think, in fact, it's probably true to say it was almost exclusively white school. And history was my favourite subject, but it was very much white history. It was taught by white teachers. And it's really only the last 35 years or so, when I've been researching more and looking into black history a lot more, that I've come to understand that British history is very much more diverse than anything I was taught at school, and I think much more interesting. I think there is a tendency perhaps to think about black British history as starting in 1948 with the arrival of the Empire Windrush. But of course it goes back many centuries before that, and a lot of it isn't so well known. It's certainly not taught in schools. Not everybody will know, for instance, that Britain was ruled by a black man during Roman times when the Emperor Septimus Severus was Emperor of Rome. And he actually spent the last few years of his life in England and died in York in, I think the year was AD 211. So there is a black presence that goes back a very long way, right to Roman times. And indeed, I think there's archaeological evidence that suggests there were black people in Britain before Roman times. And you can dip into British history at almost any period and come up with evidence of a black presence. It's well known that there were black people in Britain during Tudor times. We've got a picture of one of them, a guy called John Blank, who was a trumpeter at the court of King Henry VII and then King Henry VIII. We've even got a letter that he signed because he petitioned King Henry VIII for a pay rise. And he must have been quite good at his job because he got that pay rise. If you jump forward to Georgian times, I think it's estimated that London alone had a black population of about 10,000 during Georgian times. And one of those black men in London at that time was a guy called Olaudah Equiano, who was quite important in the abolition of the slave trade. But you won't really hear about him in school, I don't think. You might hear, if you're lucky, about William Wilberforce and possibly others, but you're very unlikely to hear the name of Equiano, which is a shame because he was just as important as the others. But of course he was black and they were white. You also won't probably hear about the fact that there were black soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo and black sailors at the Battle of Trafalgar. These are iconic moments in British history, but the black presence there just isn't spoken about at all. But when we come forward to the 1880s, then we start to get into the era of professional football. And that's where I want to start talking about some of the footballers and the ways in which their experiences, I think, have illustrated different aspects of the Black British experience since the 1880s. I mean, the first Black professional footballer anywhere is reckoned to be Arthur Walton, and he's the first player who appears in our book in chronological terms. He was the first Black player at Preston North End and at Sheffield United. He played for Preston in the FA Cup even before the Football League had started. The league started in 1888, and he'd played for Preston in 1886 in cup games. And he also later went on and played in the league for Rotherham Town and then also for Sheffield United. And his background is quite interesting. He was born in West Africa to middle-class parents, relatively well off, and they sent him to England to be educated. And the hope was that he would follow in his father's footsteps and become a Methodist minister. But when he got to England, it was evident that he was extremely good at sport, not just football, but actually several sports. And I'm afraid, from his parents' point of view, probably to their disappointment, he never did become a Methodist minister and instead pursued a career as a professional sportsman. He wasn't, he basically, he played for a number of teams. He appears in our book in those two chapters, Sheffield and Preston, but he played for a number of other teams who aren't in the league anymore. But as I say, his background was interesting. It was middle class and it was African. The next player I'm going to talk about, not the next player chronologically in our book, we skip a couple to get to Walter Tull. Walter's background was very different. He was the grandson of an enslaved man on Barbados. And Walter's father had come to England and had settled down in Folkestone in Kent, where he married a local white lady. Walter was one of their children. Walter's somebody who is possibly a better known name because teachers sometimes talk about him during the Black History Month, because not only was he a footballer, he played for Tottenham and also Northampton, but he also was an officer in the First World War. His football career was interrupted in 1914 by the outbreak of war. He signed up very quickly and he served all the way through till 1918, when unfortunately he died in France in March of that year, I think it was. He's often said to have been the first Black British officer in the army. I think subsequently people have shown that that's not quite true. There were others before him, but nonetheless, it was extremely unusual for a Black man to be put in a position of leading white troops. In fact, army regulations at the time specifically forbade it. You had to be of pure European descent to be an officer. So Walter Tull was a pioneer in footballing terms, one of the very first Black players to play professional football in England, but he was also a pioneer in sort of wider terms in the army. After the war, the next player I want to talk about very, very briefly is a guy called Eddie Paris. And the reason I just want to mention him is because Eddie's father, who was also called Eddie, had also served in World War I. Eddie Paris Sr. Had originally come from Barbados and settled in Chepstow in Wales. And he signed up and served, I think, in the Royal Engineers. Eddie Sr. was wounded during the war, but he, unlike Walter Tull, he survived. And his son, Eddie Paris, would go on to become the first Black player to play for Wales at full international level. Bill might talk about Eddie Paris in more detail, so I'll pass on from him. The next player I'm going to mention is a chap called Albert Payne. And the reason I want to talk about Albert is because he illustrates another aspect of Black British history and Black British experience. Albert's grandfather also came from Barbados. He was probably the son of an enslaved man on Barbados, although we never quite were able to establish that for certain. But Albert's grandfather was born a free man and he travelled, and like many sailors do and did, he settled in Liverpool. And in Liverpool, he met and married a local white girl. They had children. and one of those children married another white girl, and between them they had Albert Payne, who became, as I say, Tranmere Rovers' first black player. And the interesting thing I find about Albert's story is that if you look at a team photo of Tranmere Rovers with Albert in it, um, you would not be able to pick him out as black. And yet we know, for a fact that he had a black grandparent. And this is something that interests me in particular because of our children. I mean, my wife and I look at our children, and we're aware of the fact that if they marry white people, then their children are going to be, to all intents and purposes, white. We recently had our first grandson, and although we haven't actually been able to sort of physically meet him because of the circumstances, it's pretty obvious from the photos that when he grows up, nobody's really going to know of his black heritage at all. So that's another aspect of the Black British experience, the tendency for it to disappear. And I can't help wondering how many people are walking around. If we think back to those 10,000 people who lived in Georgian London, how many descendants of them are there walking around completely unaware of the fact that they have a black heritage? Just as a sideline, I mean, I should mention that Albert also served his country during the war. He served in the Second World War and was actually involved in the D-Day landings and was wounded in the D-Day landings, but survived and lived to a ripe old age. The next player I was going to mention again illustrates another aspect of the Black British experience. This is a man called Steve Stacy. Steve was born in Bristol and is the first black player in our book in, I think, for 3 clubs: Ipswich Town, Charlton Athletic and Exeter City. Steve's father was a black American GI who served in the war in Britain during the Second World War. He was based near Bristol, met Steve's father, and they had a baby, Steve. But in those days, the American authorities were absolutely, utterly opposed to any sort of mixed relationships. If they got wind of a relationship going on, they would often transfer the black soldier to a different base at the other end of the country to forcibly break the relationship up. And if the man went to his commanding officer and asked for permission to marry his white sweetheart, as he was obliged to do by the army regulations, permission was invariably refused. So Steve grew up, brought up by his mother and his grandparents, not knowing his father at all. But in later life, he was able to track his father down, and he met up with him in America. And the father explained, there was no way that I could have taken your mother back to America with me. I was basically from the southern states, and there would have been a real possibility of me being lynched if I had turned up with a white woman and a mixed heritage child. So I think that illustrates another aspect of Black British history. There were about 2,000 of these children born in those circumstances. They were known officially as brown babies. And we were quite surprised when we just stumbled across Steve's story and researching the book and discovered that we had our very own brown baby. And I think there's another one as well, a guy called Stan Horn, who features in the book for Manchester City, is almost certainly also the son of a black American GI who during the war. The final player I wanted to mention was a guy called Viv Anderson, because I think the story of the Andersons is a perfect illustration, really, of the Windrush generation. Viv Anderson's parents came to England from Jamaica in 1954 and 1955, and Viv was born in 1956. The family had settled in Nottingham, and round about the time of Viv's second birthday, there was a race ride in Nottingham. Basically, I called it a race ride, but really what happened was a black man was seen out with a white girl, and he was attacked by a group of white racists. And perhaps the surprising thing about Nottingham was the strength of feeling amongst the black communities was such that they fought back pretty hard. And a great deal of blood was shed in mass fights between the black and the white gangs. And fortunately, nobody was killed, but quite a few people did need hospital treatment. And the local paper described the scene as like an abattoir. There was so much blood. So this was a pretty inhospitable atmosphere that the Andersons were bringing their children up in, and you can't help thinking how they must have felt. You know, they'd come thousands of miles from Jamaica for what they hoped would be a better life, to be greeted with such hostility. But they did stick it out, and you have to say you can only imagine the pride that Viv's father must have felt in 1978, November 1978, when he went to Wembley and saw his son step out as the first full England international, first black full England international. Um, so I think the Andersons, this is such a story of the Windrush. They came as part of the Windrush generation. They faced hostility like so many of the Windrush generation did. They stuck it out and they survived. And as a family, they have contributed enormously to British society. It's worth mentioning that Viv's mother, Myrtle, when she came to England, she was a qualified teacher. But when she applied for teaching jobs in England, she was told her qualifications were worthless here. And so, although she did eventually get a job in a school, it was as a dinner lady. And I think very much to Myrtle's credit, she did retrain as a nurse and actually worked for many years in the NHS. And that's a fairly familiar story for people of that generation. I mean, I have spoken to nurses who, I know one nurse who came from British Guyana. She'd worked for several years as a nurse in British Guyana. She wasn't just a trainee, she was a fully qualified, experienced nurse. And she too was told her qualifications as a nurse counted for nothing here and that she had to retrain, which she did do. And she worked for many, many years in the NHS. So in many ways, the Anderson story typifies so much of what that generation experienced and so much of what they went through. And I'm going to just conclude really by saying, I mean, what I wanted to do was set out a kind of broad framework of how these players, I think, fit into Black British history. And Bill will talk in more detail about some other individual players. But for me, there's a lot of material here that teachers could use. I mean, I know that some teachers also already talk about Walter Tull in the context of the World War I, particularly during Black History Month. But the Viv Anderson family is a perfect story to use in the context of migration, which I think is on the national curriculum. So there's no reason why teachers shouldn't use Viv Anderson as an example, and his family as an example of migration and how migration has changed and, in my view, improved Britain. So the next thing that my wife and I are doing really is developing teacher resources that we think teachers would be able to use to tell some of these stories, because not all Black children are especially interested in history. I mean, I think it's a fairly common thing to hear them say, well, I'm not interested in history because I don't see anybody like myself talked about in the lessons that we have. And so talk about footballers, Black footballers, would I think give teachers an opportunity to draw Black children in particular into the subject of history in general. And I do think it's important that everybody understands this history, not just Black children. I think it's important that white children and white people understand this Black history as well, because we do now live in a multicultural society. And I think it's important that we all understand where we've all come from, the fact we've come from different places, and that the fact that we've brought different skills and different knowledge to our society, and that we contribute in many different ways. So I'm going to finish there, and as I say, Bill will talk more about some of the footballers in greater detail.